Hello everyone! Happy New Year's Eve and Happy New Year's on the final day of 2020. I figured we finally get around to covering a tier list for every single mythic in Gems of War. And gosh, is there a lot of them. There's like over 60 these days. So it has been quite some time since we have covered a tier list. I believe it has actually been about a year and a half or so. And given that we just got some rebounds the other week in the final mythic, or final two mythics end up coming in a couple weeks ago of the year, I figured we cover every single one up to the end of 2020. As you can see on screen right now, we end up making up the list beforehand, and basically during the duration of this video, we are going to be going all over all of them, starting all the way from S tier and working our way down. Of course, quite a few of these are subjective as far as where they are, but from my personal experience, most of these are about where they go as far as how strong they are. Some of them are based more so on overall aspects, where some of them are based a little bit more on what they can do absolute best, given that a lot of different categories within Gems of War, of course, use different teams. So something that might be really good in one area might not be as good in another. So generally, most of these things are based on their absolute best area in most situations, unless there's just so many things in that area where they're just kind of outclassed by pretty much everything where they're normally used, in which case I would put them a little bit lower on the list, kind of like Ubisoft or something like that. But anyways, let's start getting into this, starting all the way from S tier. So, of course, the almighty Zugaf. So if we go all the way down to Zugaf, of course, being the absolute hardest mythic to get in the game, tied with the other one, the Enraged Carandera. Theoretically, these aren't actually mythics in a sense. They are doomed rarity troops or boss rarity troops. However, I am including them as there is currently only 2 of them within the game. However, there, of course, will be more going into the future. So, of course, this ends up getting a gigantic buff about 2 years ago or so, where it ends up removing the cooldown on its ability. Before, it used to only be able to cast once and only once, regardless of how many Zugafs you had or how much mana you gave it. You would only be able to cast it once and never again. However, that's not the case anymore. For 32 mana, it can cast its ability as many times as it wants. So it can cast it once and then do it again and then do it again and do it again until the entire enemy team is dead. It has freeze onto all enemies, which is, of course, one of the stronger mechanics in the entire game, preventing them from getting extra turns. It also gets to, of course, instantly kill whatever it touches, which then synergizes into a 12 skull creation into its burn. This basically allows the very high amount of triple damage burning hero classes to be able to go and do triple damage burning to them. And with new hero classes such as Slayer hero classes and other similar hero classes that were already pretty good at doing triple damage to burning, there's just a really wide option as far as the range at which you can end up using with Zugaf, which ends up making him one of the strongest options within the game. Of course, also being very hard to obtain due to the 8 power orbs. It's generally not something you would want to prioritize super early on in the game. However, you do want to be saving pretty much every blue orb you ever get for the eventual Zugaf in order to make all the power orbs. On top of that, also has Impervious, and also very few things have Jinx. Jinx ends up making it so whenever they take a 3, it has less of a chance that they will end up getting a surge off their mana, which can be pretty useful, and it's mostly useful if you can get another Jinx with it. There's not really a multi-Jinx synergy too much at the moment with him. As time goes on, there'll probably be even more options and make him even stronger. Anyways, next up, and probably the first thing you'd really want to craft. I was going to craft this on my Switch account about a year and a half. However, the Switch version didn't actually start with Iron Gut within the game. However, it is definitely the highest priority of something that you would want to craft in the current state of the game. The main reason being is once you end up getting yourself an Iron Gut, you will be able to go do the entirety of Delves, and I mean pretty much the entirety. All you really need is a cheap curse option like Mirage Queen or something like that, and from Sunken Fleet, and you're pretty much good to go. You just end up cursing them, and then you can devour all of them. If you don't have a really high attack damage early on in the game, you can end up using things like Season Medals, which you can get pretty quickly through how common World Lore events are, and since those don't have this exact same amount of gain of attack as Rainia's in the current state of the game, you can just end up using those, get 12 attack, and pretty much get them good to go. Between the bonuses, everything, loop a bunch of mana with Apothecary and other similar things that end up creating brown, and you got yourself a Devour. You just go and Devour based on whatever your attack is. Once you end up securing a Devour on a enemy, you gain all their attacks, so you'll be able to basically have 100% attack their fourth, and then you just keep going and attacking over and over again, devouring every single thing. And if they have any immune, you can just do a curse onto them, and you'll be able to still devour them as if they didn't have anything at all. This works insanely good for Delves, and is the main thing you'd want to get if you are finding it hard to get through Delves. You want to get this pretty early on because everything beyond like 100 or so can start getting pretty difficult early on in the game, but once you have an Iron Gut, you can pretty much breeze through all of it. It's still not going to be an absolute auto win, but it's the single-handedly best thing that you can end up picking up in order to help yourself with Delves, so definitely make sure to go get yourself an Iron Gut. Next on the list is, oddly enough, Phoenicia. Phoenicia ended up going up quite a lot compared to last time. The main reason being, about a year ago, about a year and 2 months ago, we ended up getting medals into the game. Medals are things that can end up increasing stats as far as upgrading them beyond their level. Like, for example, you can actually give Phoenicia another 6 damage, which I haven't done to her yet, but we could at some point. But aside from that, you can also set it for your global bonus. So one of those bonuses that you could do, of course, is Nisha, which is 4 additional magic, and you have 3 of them for a total of 12 additional magic. This is going to be very strong for something like Phoenicia, because she can double the amount of damage she does, and based on all of her other boost ratios she has the single highest full AoE damage in the entire game. This is insanely good for quick wiping things. The main reason why she's so good is she's the absolute quickest thing for running pets. She's the absolute quickest thing for running dungeons, and she's one of the quickest options for running the daily adventure board. One other thing that she's really good for is running through Explore 5 and 6. Both of these end up giving you 2 trophies, which for guilds that want to try farming trophies is actually the highest trophy rate in the entire game. She can also do this for higher loot when you're doing something like a Gnome Vault event, and those are insanely good value to end up farming, and she can end up doing that on a higher difficulty compared to something like Rowan that would normally do it on something like Explore 3 or 4. She can end up upping it up all the way to about 5, 6, and I believe possibly even 7 if you have that additional magic on her from being fully upgraded. So she can get really far as her full AoE damage output and just instantly kill. And as it currently stands, strongest thing that can do that in one single cast. She's not really good if she has to cast like a second time. However, whenever she can get that first cast kill, really optimal when she can do it, but something like Rowan or other similar options don't have the range to end up doing it. Anyways, next up on our list, we got ourselves the Wild Queen. So Wild Queen, really good in PvP-like situations, particularly Guild Wars. She basically has every single thing that you'd want to end up using with it. The main thing that's also pretty good about her is she's Elemental and Wild Folk, meaning that she can half mana start in 2 different ways. While this doesn't overlap to Guild Wars, it does overlap to whenever you're doing something like PvP. The reason you can't use either of those in Guild Wars is none of them share overlap with her. But as far as her ability, she gets to steal a bunch of attack, which means they lower their attack and you gain attack. You also get to end up creating a mix of green and skulls. So basically she not only feeds mana back into herself, but she can also skull spam into the same regard. So you basically get to lower down the enemy attack. Even if you end up missing, they still do basically nothing with her skulls, and you just get to pile them with a bunch of damage. So she not only gets to loop skull extra turn, she gets to do green extra turn into her own mana, and she gets to completely disable their attack while also having a below average mana cost as far as mythics are concerned. She ended up getting a buff about a year and a half ago where she ended up getting a higher mixture of the green and skulls. And while you still need the board set up a little bit to actually be able to get this extra turn, it is normally more often not set up enough that you can just go for and just kind of get her looping. And aside from that, she does get to create a Bone Storm when an ally dies, so she can end up utilizing that to even get even more of her consistency up if you need that after one of your allies end up dying. And she also gets a little bit of bonus to all the wild folk on the team every single turn, though that's generally one of her weaker aspects overall. Next up, we got ourselves the Grey King. So Grey King, one of the ones I think I put closer to like B tier or so last time around. However, he ended up getting a pretty substantial bonus recently. Alphabet, how do you work? Grey King, where are you? Grey King, Grey King, Grey King. Oh, it's the Grey King. Why would you do this? Why would you be the Grey King and not just the... Okay, I guess that kind of makes sense, but still. I hate when they do that, because everything that has the word "the" ends up going all the way down to the T's. But anyways, as far as Grey King, so the main thing that makes him really good, we, on Halloween, ended up getting a 50% undead start. So as far as undead starting mana. So this was a substantial buff to Grey King. Actually, so much of a buff, this is the second ever Mythic I ended up actually crafting. There are 2 of them. It is Grey King and Ferris Raw. Ferris Raw, of course, being the first one that I crafted so we'd have 4 Ferris Raws. And the other one was Grey King, where I had 1 copy and I ended up crafting him in order to have 2. But yeah, Grey King, insanely good option now that he can start with a half mana start. He gets to destroy all gems of a chosen color, so you get to choose, and that is destroy, so you get it back. So if you do something like brown, blue, or purple, he will accumulate back into himself. All enemies of that color end up taking a bunch of true damage and are then mana drain, silence, and frozen. This is pretty good because if the opposing team has multiple of that same color, particularly 3 or 4, you end up disabling pretty much their entire team. And silence freeze, really strong combination. And having that on top of the mana drain is just insanely good, combined with the true damage. Just does so much together. And you also get a little bit of undead synergy, given that you're going to be probably half mana starting it with an undead anyways. Now that that's basically become meta for the setup for it, you then also get to give all undead allies a bunch bunch of armor and magic every single turn, which of course also ends up increasing his amount of potential damage output. So it ends up working out really good. It's generally used with other true damage options, normally used as a counter to basically any team that's running 3 to 4 of a similar color. So there's a lot of range you can end up doing with it. Not really used for delves or stuff like that, but in PvP and Guild War like situations, really strong. Speaking of that, next up is Araneweaver. So as far as Araneweaver is concerned, this became really popularized, obviously, with Wardbreaker, and I think at this point, Wardbreaker hero class has been nerfed as many times as it possibly can, so it is definitively probably going to stay exactly as is for a while, because, gosh, they cannot figure out, I don't think they can figure out another way to nerf this thing any more than they already have. So it's still insanely good to be able to use with it. So basically, the way that Araneweaver is generally used is it's normally used with a second slot Wardbreaker using Life and Death, all of which have gotten nerfed. Life and Death having higher mana costs, the Wardbreaker having lower chance to summon its spider, but basically it's used with that in second slot, Araneweaver and third slot, and then you basically could do anything for your first and second, normally used with an Empower in first slot with a half mana elf start in your last slot. This can be revamped into a couple different ways, like with a double stealthy in the middle. You don't necessarily need to use Wardbreaker, but it's the most common way to end up doing with this. Basically, the main thing that makes Araneweaver very strong is its very last trait, really just its traits in general. Pretty much on paper has like the best trait setup in the game, or among one of the best. It has stealthy, so it can't be targeted directly, impervious, so it has immune to pretty much everything in the game, and it has a 75% chance to summon the best summon of any summon that any troop has, which is a Web Spinner. Web Spinner has triple damage on Skull, and when I say triple damage on Skull, I mean pretty much always, because it ends up triple damaging anything that does not have immune to Web, and pretty much only things that have impervious have immune to Web, because the things that just have immune to Web pretty much aren't meta in any way, shape, or form. So it's pretty much only the troops that have impervious are kind of immune to it. So it ends up getting a very, very wide range as far as what it can end up doing additional damage to, and it's just insanely good for a summon. And on top of that, it also gets to do a 4x web. There are other things in the current state of the game that are capable of doing that for cheaper now. However, it's still pretty good value with everything else that it gets to do. Has a double true damage, so it gets to hit that HP directly, and hits for the last slot, so it's synergized pretty good with something like Life and Death. And if it actually ends up getting a kill, it basically does a Gorgotha worth of Explosion, which is normally a 15 cost mana spell, which you can end up doing for 20 costs with everything else that ends up doing. So pretty good overall, and insanely strong. Next up, we got ourselves Mistrals. So Mistrals is mostly used for its final trait. However, it is one of 2 mythics that have an extra turn on its ability. The other one, both are in S tier, by the way, just to show how ridiculously strong it is to have extra turn on your ability automatically as a mythic. Of course, the first one that ever got it was Iron Gut, and the second one, of course, is Mistrals. The main thing that Mistrals is used for, aside from her extra turn ability, is, of course, her enchant. She 4 times enchants the entire team whenever you end up taking an extra turn. This is basically 2 mana to all of your allies per turn, and assuming you have the entire team, it's basically 8 mana per turn for simply taking a single extra turn. This is insanely good value, and just pumps your entire team up with mana. Even if you're completely blocked on some of your troops, you will still keep accumulating mana. As far as its ability, it deals splash damage. It's kind of like the Infernus-like troops, except a much better version of it. It deals splash damage to a single enemy, 1 to 4 hit randomly. Unfortunately, this is 1 to 4, so sometimes it will hit 1 or 2 when you need it to be hitting 3 or 4, which is very unfortunate with it. However, overall, still pretty good. And it also gets to jumble the board, which is a mechanic that pretty much almost nothing uses, but it basically just reshuffles the board. It won't automatically have like any kind of extra turns that directly get taken. However, you could swipe for them and still end up getting them that way. However, the board, unlike an explosion where you explode and you can like immediately get 5 times and stuff like that, a jumble will never do that. It can make it so you could swipe for 5 times, but it will never directly put things adjacent 5 times or 4 times or stuff like that, or even 3 times for that matter. You'd have to manually go and move them from there. But it automatically gets the extra turn, so as long as she's not frozen, she gets a lot of value from that, and you can basically use it as a board shuffle that you basically get for free. There's a lot of teams that spam a lot of blue and brown, not as many that do yellow, but blue and brown in particular. A lot of teams that can end up spamming that to quite a excess, and you can end up utilizing that by basically having it all go into your Mistrals, which ends up working out pretty good. Anyways, next up, a troop I don't personally use too much, however, it is insanely good, and that is Lord of Slaughter. So this is arguably the best mythic that actually ended up coming out in the year of 2020. So if we go over to Lord of Slaughter, and I can learn the alphabet sometime today, we can go and... Wait, is he called the Lord of Slaughter? There's no way he's called the Lord of Slaughter. Is he called the Lord of Slaughter? There's no way. He is called the Lord. Why? Why must you add the word the in front of some... How many of these have the, so we know? Let's see. There's the Great King, the Lord of Slaughter, the Possessed King, the Wild Queen, and the Wardbreaker. Why? Anyways, the Lord of Slaughter creates 6 brown gems. It's basically like a Shegra, but better. It creates 6 brown gems, then converts all brown gems to Doom Skulls. It then inflicts 1 to 2 bleeds and 1 to 2 death marks on the enemy team. Of course, the convert being the main aspect that you end up using. So brown still been a very meta color this year, and still is. There's a lot of things that end up doing it between Mountain Crusher, Apothecary, Harpy Mage, and just everything. There's just a lot of brown spam, Truffle, Beatrix. So between all the things that end up creating brown, you can basically use this as a hard counter to that, convert all the browns into Doom Skulls, hit them for absurd amount of damage. Doom Skulls are still a little bit glitchy in the current state of the game, so whenever you spam a lot of them, they kind of hit like for absurd value. So if you can just get a gigantic clump, it's pretty much auto-killing whatever you touch. On top of that, he's actually more of a second slot than a first slot. It does seem like at first he'd be more of a first slot, but a really solid second slot, mostly because his higher mana cost makes him so he kind of has to be second slot. 27 mana cost, a little bit high, but you get so much value from all the explosions that's normally worth it. But he has some score reduction to go with it. He has a Doomstorm at the start of battle, so you even get that ramp all the way from the beginning. And he actually has what used to be way back in the day, like 5 years back, one of the most broken things in the entire game. 100% chance to ignore armor when doing skull damage. This isn't as strong in the current state of the game. However, it still basically allows all his skulls to essentially act as true damage instead of physical damage. He's the only troop in the entire game that currently has this capability, where his skulls essentially are just entirely true damage, whereas some things are just percent chance that'll be true damage. His are entirely true damage, so whenever he does end up getting that skull pokes, he basically needs half as much to end up killing. So if they have like 100 armor and 100 HP, well, he only needs to hit that 100 HP in order to end up killing it out, which makes it even easier for all of his skull spam to just wipe out everything. Really strong option. I personally don't care for using as much compared to like Zugoff and stuff like that. However, that doesn't make him any less weak. So definitely really strong. Next up, something that was originally going to be like probably C tier, maybe even D tier, prior to like a week ago. However, we end up getting a spider the other week, which just absolutely made Mother of Darkness absurd. It's a rogue spider. It was the night spider actually specifically, and this just absolutely made Mother of Darkness insane. It also kind of nerfed Ketris a little bit more because this is double stealthy in the middle. But more on that when we get to him. But night spider, just insane rogue synergy, creates a bunch of blue and purple. Basically made Mother of Darkness. It is so S tier that it basically made Mother of Darkness S tier. But basically what she does is she deals true damage to an enemy and the enemy below them, which is okay. It's a double true damage poke. It's boosted by purple gems, so it goes a little bit higher. Let's say there's like 10 purple gems. Okay, 10 more damage. And if the enemy dies, ends up creating 12 purple. Well, this seems a little bit weird because, well, she doesn't use purple. However, this goes right into Night Spider's green-purple and basically allows the blue-purple to just loop infinitely with it. And otherwise also has a backup summon, so you can kind of do that. Summons are pretty weak, but it does have backup summon for those instances. But it has a purple storm when you end up getting a kill, which ends up synergizing with it. Has stealthy, which ends up synergizing with it, so both of them won't get targeted and everything else in your team will. So you could deliberately end up doing that. And on top of all of that, it also gets to inflict bleed to all enemies whenever matching for an extra turn. So you can basically stack a 10 or 4 stack of bleeds, which does 10 true damage per turn. So even when you're losing your turns, you're still doing 10 additional true damage to all the enemies and just stacking that for every single turn until it goes away. So you just get absurdly good true damage, and you just kind of keep looping that. It also got buffed even more by the fact that you can now summon rogues, or you can now summon the bandits. You can summon bandits now. Bandits actually got buffed when they got nerfed a couple weeks ago, in that you can now have them without stealthy, and having them without stealthy can now make it so you can go and summon them off a hero class, off of things that end up dying, and then they don't have stealthy anymore, so they have to be targeted. So basically, it makes it even tankier now that you won't have these stealthy things in a way that will make it so when your entire team is stealthied, they can target anything. Now that it doesn't have stealthy, you can end up getting those summons there, and now they have to specifically target the bandits before they target your other stealthy related units. So really strong in that regard, and just ended up making her even more buff than she already got from the spider coming in. So kind of got double buffed within a single week as far as her viability. And even though she hasn't been touched, she basically went all the way from like D tier to S tier in just a single week, so pretty insane. Next up on our list, and the final one of S tier, is Ferris Raw. So Ferris Raw, overall the weakest thing on this list. Its damage output is pretty minuscule. Even once you get the max souls, it's not really hitting for that much. However, that's not the reason why you're using Ferris Raw. The reason you're using Ferris Raw is entirely for its final trait. It is 150% soul gain. This saves you hours upon hours upon hours upon dozens of, maybe even hundreds of hours of grinding within this game. This just substantially increases the amount of souls that you can end up accumulating compared to something like a 50% increase, which would be the highest that you would have without having a Ferris Raw. This is really good when using one or two of them in various soul farming teams, particularly Phylactery into Sacrificial Priest into double Ferris Raw is one of the stronger ones, and without double Ferris Raw, you go like a Leprechaun or something else, end up doing that, and you do it on Explore 1. Really, really strong option. Actually, I believe I had the team set up right over here, but really, really strong option. And well, essentially the strongest thing that you can even run for souls in the current state of the game. Insanely strong. This became possible ever since all the magic increases. Now that Phylactery has enough magic to reach 40 within a single cast, this team actually ends up working out a little bit better than the Dragon Soul build. Well, the Dragon Soul build still ends up working out. This does end up doing it a little bit better, and just gains pretty much about 50,000 souls per hour or so. So with double Ferris Raw. So yeah, insanely good. Saves you so much time, because otherwise with no Ferris Raws, I believe the absolute best rate you can really get is about 25,000 or so without having like ultra high VIP. But with Ferris Raws, you can pretty much double the amount that you can end up doing. So it ends up saving you a lot of time, in that if you were soul farming for some like 10 hours and you end up getting double the value, well, you basically just saved yourself half that time. So, or double that time. So definitely highly advise getting these. It's also one of those mythics that if you end up getting a second one, or if you craft one and end up getting a second one, you don't feel bad, because getting a second Ferris Raw is actually useful, whereas you might not necessarily go out of your way for it, but if you randomly get it, it's kind of good. Whereas if you craft something like, let's say, an Iron Gut, while Iron Gut's still insanely good to get early, if you happen to randomly get a second Iron Gut, that kind of feels a little bad, because the second one basically becomes useless. But Ferris Raw is one of those few troops that is kind of immune to that, in that you can definitely use another one when you get it, and theoretically you could even use 3 and 4. However, the double Ferris Raw teams do kind of hold up as the better overall option. Anyways, one list down. We still got 5 to go. Gosh, it's going to take longer than I expected. But we're going through all of it for New Year's. But anyways, so next up on our list is all of A tier, as you can see right over there. So let's start getting into it. First things first is, of course, Carandera. So, actually, or sorry, is that Obsidius? Never mind, that's Obsidius. Next one's Carandera. So, Obsidius. Main thing this thing is used for is it's 4x stun. 4x stun, insanely good utility option. Stun, of course, ends up disabling all traits for the duration of the stun. This basically makes it so they can't use any of their traits. Of course, this won't hit something like Impervious, but you could end up cursing stunning it. Foreshadowing to Carandera. But yeah, it's a really strong combo, curse stun, or even just stun if they don't have a need for cursing them. As far as its ability, it's a little bit underwhelming, but it makes up for it with all of its traits. It has Brown Storm into itself. It has a 50% score reduction, and ends up getting, of course, the main component being the stun. As far as its ability, it's one of the better ones that have a 5x5 block. It's a little bit of a weird mechanic, but it can still do some board control with it. It has a heavy splash, which is 75% to adjacents as well. And the only thing I really don't understand is why it's a percent chance to do its other splash. Even at 100% chance, it would still do less damage than Infernus, but I guess they figured the traits were already so good that they just kind of kept it that way. But unfortunately, his damage output kind of pretty inconsistent, even more so than Mistrals in some sense. But overall, you're not really using him for his damage. You're using him mostly for his very final trait, and that's pretty much entirely it. Next up, of course, is Carandera, which very similar kind of concept to Obsidius as far as what it does. It ends up getting a 4x curse. It is 50% chance. However, you're normally doing enough extra turns if you're hitting an extra turn to be able to hit it. However, do be mindful that it isn't 100%, though it's after a few, you're definitely going to be able to get it. It also has Impervious to go with it, so you generally won't lose it to like a stun or something like that. And it's also, to this day, the only mythic that has a single +1 link. Of course, there is the queen that ends up having the +6, or the 1 to all, the Queen Aurora that does the +1 to all. However, it is the only mythic to this date that has a single +1, oddly enough, other than Enrage Carandera. I believe that he ended up getting it too, but the Caranderas. But anyways, as far as Carandera, it's basically a weaker version, or weaker but also stronger version of Enrage Carandera. Enrage Carandera costs as much as Zugoff, and you generally want to get obviously Zugoff first, because Carandera is a perfectly fine replacement for Enrage Carandera, and in many instances is better. Not only is its final trait better, but it has a lower mana cost for its ability. It's only a 26 mana cost. As far as its ability, ends up dealing damage to an enemy, and is boosted by all Doom Skulls at 10 times, and then it converts all yellows to Doom Skulls, which can end up hitting for a decent amount of damage if you get alignment on that, and also ends up conjuring a Doom Storm, so even after you get value and explode the board from that, you end up getting even more Doom Skulls onto the board, and can kind of follow up on that as well. However, it is used almost entirely for its curse, of course, similar to that of the similar to that of Obsidius. Anyways, next up on our list, we got Tina 9000. So, Tina 9000, main thing that is the gimmick with this thing is, of course, the spell reduction that Tina 9000 has. It ends up having a 50% spell reduction, which actually in this current state of the game is not the highest spell reduction in the game. There was a legend added this year that has a 75% reduction. However, the main reason why Tina 9000 is still insanely good with this aspect, and actually is better than it in most situations, is the armor gain that it has on its ability. So it ends up gaining a really high amount of armor whenever it does its cast. So if you're up against a physical damage team that's doing physical spell damage as its primary source, like a Yagwe Queen of Tanya, or, you know, really any team that is heavily hitting you with physical spell damage, Tina 9000 ends up being the best tank as far as being able to take it out. So you have the armor gain there, you have the spell reduction there. On top of that, it also gets to use the armor for additional skull damage. This is generally used similar to Lord of Slaughter as a second slot, in that you basically wait till your first slot dies, and then you can kind of get value off of that as you're getting your mana up and everything, as you generally want to cast this at least once before you're starting to take skulls against the opposing team with it. Otherwise, you'll lose all your armor too quickly and won't really get the value out of the final trait where it gets to use its skulls for additional damage. On top of that, it also gets a triple damage true damage. They also fixed this about a year and a half ago or so it does retroactively retarget correctly, whereas before it would sometimes waste some of its shots. However, now it doesn't waste any of its shots, so you end up getting all that damage down, and you're pretty much good to go. It just does its damage, normally ends up securing a kill in a PvP-like situation, and just a really good tank while also having good offense. Only thing it's really missing is some board control. Speaking of that, another thing, Catches the Bull. Catches the Bull, actually, I would have placed probably in the past more towards S tier. However, the main thing that ended up making him fall off is a lot of stealthy in the current state of the game. There are a lot of really meta teams that run stealthy in both second and third slot simultaneously. This is really bad for Catches the Bull, because Catches the Bull's premise is to cast onto second slot and then cast onto fourth slot, and the weaker version of it is to cast on the first slot and then cast off onto third if they had stealthy on like, let's say, second or fourth or something. But when they put stealthy on second and third, it forces him to have to hit first slot and fourth slot, which makes him a lot weaker. He's also not as good at making a comeback. His main premise in the current state of the game is to run him for higher level delves and for Tower of Doom, more so for Tower of Doom, mostly because things like Iron Gut and stuff like that can normally work out a little bit better for delves. The other big issue with him is that you need pretty much Yasmin's Pride in order to make him work properly. There's a couple other ways to feed him stats like Earth's Fury and stuff like that. However, overall, you're generally going to be wanting to do Yasmin's Pride in order to end up increasing his damage output, and this can be a little bit slow at times. It takes a little bit of setup, and you kind of have to keep poking with it. But whenever you can get that second slot, fourth slot kind of poke, it is still kind of worth going for. But just compared to other options that are coming out for delves between Iron Gut, Zugoff, and other similar things, he's just not used as often. He's still good on some color restrictions, but definitely not as good as he used to be. And in PvP-like situations, you might as well not even bother. Now the meta is starting to shift in such a way that he's pretty much unusable in PvP, I would say, against not every team, but against a growing number of teams, he's becoming increasingly less usable. However, one thing that actually became more usable is Guard's Avatar. So, Guard's Avatar, main thing with this is lower level delve ranges. Between all the armor gain that we ended up getting from metals, similar to Rowan, he ended up gaining quite a bit of a benefit from this. One other benefit that he got within the last year or so is 50% night starts. That didn't used to be a thing in the past, but is now. Before you would have to do it off of Divine, which made for a little bit of a clunkier team. However, now that he is 50% night start, also Divine got nerfed to 40% as well in the current state of the game. But with the 50% night start, this ended up making him a lot better. It comes with a skull spamming troop, so you can end up doing that quite a bit better than what was previously possible. It's basically ran like a Rowan whenever you're color restricted out of using Rowan, so it's mostly used for the really low level delves where you basically just cast once, kill the entire thing. It's kind of in between Rowan and Phoenicia, essentially, basically as a alternative mythic. It's also, I believe, still the only mythic for White Helm, so hey, you need it anyways to go get White Helm to like 18 star or whatever it's at these days. But overall, still a really good option, basically alternative Rowan for when you're color locked out of it. Really good option overall. Obviously, it gets countered. I say it has a lot of similar problems to that of Ketris in that it's not good at making a comeback. However, generally in the game modes that you're doing it on, you're generally not going to need the comeback because similar to Ketris, you're using it primarily for delving more often than not. Speaking of delving, though, it does get used for some other things. Next up on our list is Megavore. Megavore is definitely one of those options that when it first came out, it seemed like it was going to be a lot stronger than it really was. And while it's still a really good option, it still seems just kind of above average. Well, you know, it's still really good. But basically, what this thing's premise is he ends up having, well, as far as traits, he has some really good traits on paper. He has some life gain, he has some impervious, and of course, he has an 8% chance to kill the last enemy when doing extra turn. This kind of seems absurd, when you until you realize how ridiculously hard 8% is to land. So 8%, of course, yeah, definitely does not like to land that often. That is for sure. It feels like it almost never wants to land when you want it to, and it's just exceedingly inconsistent compared to other options within the game. It does get to eliminate all armor. It is actually, I believe, yeah, to this day, the only thing in the entire game that still has a 4 times eliminate while still having the follow-up damage, which is normally enough to actually end up getting a kill as well, since it ends up doing it based on double of its magic, so it ends up getting a lot of damage there. And okay, it gets a free submerge onto itself. But overall, you're generally using it for 4 times armor eliminate, which basically makes essentially all your damage into true damage in a sense, since if they don't have another armor gain, they don't have any armor left, so basically everything's just hitting directly onto HP. And occasionally he's used for his instant kill. Overall, pretty inconsistent, but it's using some merfolk teams, it's using some monster teams, and there are some setups that you can end up doing with the armor eliminations that can go and synergize into other physical damage options that might not be used otherwise. Anyways, next, let's go to the Possessed King. And as far as his ability, the main gimmick he has is his very final trait. He ends up exploding 2 random gems whenever he does a extra turn. This is the only thing in the game currently that has a 2 explosion whenever you end up doing a extra turn like this. So pretty strong in that regard. You can end up getting a lot of mana accumulation from it. You can get a lot of board clear, especially if you're doing Doom Skull related skull spammers. In general, he's probably used a little bit more with skull spammers in general, just because you get a lot of value from whenever you're moving the board a bunch and the skulls kind of align together off of it. And if you have Doom Skulls, they kind of all explode together. Aside from that, one other pretty big gimmick that he has is the highest amount of transforms in the game. While it's not consistent, he has 3 20% transforms, meaning theoretically, if he gets super lucky, he does have the chance of triple transforming. And with how transform currently works in the game against AI, like if you're in delves or something, it will, well, aside from making them devourable, if you're using something like Iron Gut, it'll also lower the level by half. So if they were something like 500, they would go down to 250 after the first transform, then 125, then what is that, 67 or something like that after that. And basically go down from there from the multi-transform. But anyways, still overall great option, mostly used for mana accumulation. Next up, we got the Psychoax. Psychoax. So basically this troop is... Okay, Psychoax. So basically this troop ends up being really good for mana accumulation. It's basically like the trolls, except a really high mana cost, but is still situationally good. It's used very similar to that of Vespera, which is also the next one on this list. But anyways, it gets to double a chosen color gem on the board, and then creates 3 more of that color. So basically, just like trolls, and then ends up giving a bunch of life to all allies of that color. So this can end up being used to go and life spam if you needed to for a certain thing, like Ketris or something similar. But basically anything that ends up having a life boost ratio. He ends up having a impervious. He has all elementals end up gaining a attack and armor every single time at the start of turn, which generally isn't used too much, but can still be helpful given that he's used primarily in elemental teams with like a Mirage Queen for 50% start and everything like that. But basically, it's used like the trolls, except he has the option to cover absolutely anything. So generally, the way that you're using this is you're targeting either into green, blue, or brown, and so that he can feed back into himself, basically whatever is the most populated of the 3, and you basically get to choose and constantly keep getting mana into yourself. There are many instances where stuff like Forest Troll is still a better option than this thing. However, there are other instances where you can end up using this to loop quite a bit with the various teams. And while it does have quite a bit of startup to get it rolling, even with half mana start, you're still going to need 13 mana to get it rolling. Once you do get it rolling, it tends to stay going and can lead to some decent combinations with various troops within the game. Overall, not necessarily the best thing that you'd be going for with it, but definitely one of those really high mythic mana accumulators that you can end up utilizing. Similar to that, we have Shibanu Vespera, which is used pretty much for the exact same purpose, just in a slightly different way. She ends up giving random skill to an ally, creates 9 gems of the color, and then repeats that 2 more times. One weird gimmick that you can do with this is use a team of all blues, all purples, or all yellows, where all 3 of your other allies are all purely blue, or purely yellow, or purely purple, and you can end up synergizing it that way if you wanted to. Of course, you can also just use a pure color team and just hope that it ends up landing on colors they end up needing, and it basically just goes and feeds that similar mana to your entire team. Has a lot of loot potential in the sense that you could potentially get 27 of the exact same gem color onto the board, which is obviously absurdly good. However, whenever it does 18 and 9, it is also still really good because it's generally going to be landing that, and whenever it can land that, that's going to be most of your mana back, and you can just kind of keep looping it over and over again. Works very similar to what you end up doing with a Psychoax, just in a bit of a different format, and pretty much has the same kind of premise too, in that you would use it with a Mirage Queen in order to 50% mana start it to get everything rolling. So they both are used in a pretty similar kind of premise. So next one, we have Uminif. And yes, I actually did place Uminif higher than Ubistet. So Ubistet, I feel like, has been falling off increasingly more over time. But as far as Uminif, it's basically the budget version of a Zugoff. By no means is it exactly the same to a Zugoff, but that's essentially what it ends up rolling as far as what it ends up doing. So it gets to deal damage to a enemy, and then it's boosted by all their skills at a 2-to-1. So this works really good for when you're upscaling to something. However, it can still be used in a PvP-like situation. And if the enemy ends up dying, it ends up gaining not only 10 attack, but also gets to do the 12 skulls. So this thing has a lot of damage output as far as being able to use it in a PvP-like situation. It ends up gaining the 4 attack every single time you get the extra turn, has a 10 attack off of that, and it ends up doing double damage to everything that doesn't have immune to Hunter's Mark, and on top of this has a little bit of dodge. However, that's not the main aspect you're using. You're mostly using it with attacking into the double damage. So basically what you end up doing with this is you rope dart something, you then cast this, you end up getting skull spam, you then end up killing with that skull spam, and you basically got an extra turn. So essentially you get to kill 2 things with an extra turn, whereas Ubistet gets to kill 2 things with no extra turn. Ubistet also struggles to do its follow-up because it'll have less attack to boost ratio off of, whereas something like Uminif does not need to worry about that because it specifically boosts based on every single trip that is specifically targeting rather than the overall amount of attack that's within the battle. One other pretty nice thing about this is if the enemy team is boosting anything other than HP, it also makes it a little bit easier for Uminif to end up killing them. Like if they're boosting up something like magic or attack across their entire team, it makes it a little bit easier for her to specifically target stuff out as well. But overall, it's kind of like a budget Zugoff, not exactly the same thing. However, it is still pretty solid. You generally won't see me using it personally just because if you own Zugoff, you just use Zugoff instead. But you can definitely work this into a lot of teams, like with Beatrix, like with Truffle, stuff like that, particularly Beatrix, so you don't have to worry about Entangle or Freeze on her. And she can end up getting a lot of value from the cast that Beatrix ends up doing, since it ends up feeding right back into her mana, and then you can end up killing with her ability and synergizing that with like a Rope Dart or one other option. You're pretty much good to go. It's pretty strong overall. Anyways, last thing in A tier, and I believe one of the more recent ones as well, is Pan. So Pan is kind of like it's kind of like Tina 9000 but different. As far as what Pan ends up doing, I will eventually learn the alphabet, by the way. Let's see. As far as Pan, it does double its damage based on magic. So instead of doing true damage, it instead does double its damage based on magic. So essentially the same thing as a Tina 9000, just in a little bit of a different way. So it does all in physical damage. It does it to 3 random enemies, and then it knocks them to the back. Basically, this is a great way to completely disorient the opposing team. It's very situational. However, it is a very strong situational option, and generally most of these things on this tier list are based on what their best option is going to be. But basically, you want to use this whenever the enemy team is in a really specific order that they want to keep, and you just want a good damage source to end up going with it. So this is really good for disorienting while doing a really substantial amount of damage. And similar to Tina 9000, generally if you end up hitting 2 onto the same trip, it will end up getting the kill. There are some differences with it, but if you set a bunch of magic, like plus 12 magic on it, is generally going to be able to secure some kills. It does have Impervious too, which never hurts, and also gives a bunch of wild folk allies 1 life and magic every single time you take an extra turn. Keep in mind, since he does do double its magic, it does gain 2 damage every single time you do that. So if you hit something like 5 extra turns, you're doing 10 additional damage, which is theoretically 30 additional damage since you're hitting 3 different enemies. So he can stack quite a bit of damage pretty quickly. It might not seem like it, but it's mostly because he does double his magic, and then he also hits 3 targets. So every single magic he gains a lot of value out of. So any kind of teams where you're kind of like looping a bunch with it and you just kind of need that little bit of utility and just kind of poke it out, ends up working out pretty good. Biggest thing holding it back, like many of these mythics that might have a strong ability but not have follow-up, is it doesn't have any follow-up, unfortunately. No kind of board control, no kind of anything like that to end up making it a little bit better to kind of keep its longevity going. However, you're mostly using it only once to do the disorientation to the enemy team anyways, and beyond that point you don't really need to cast it again unless you're just doing the final blow. Anyways, that is everything now for A tier. We're now moving down to B tier. As you can see there, we have Enrage Carandera as the very first thing. It looks the exact same as Carandera, so I had to put an E next to it just to kind of identify them. So let's start getting into B tier. So as far as B tier is concerned, this is actually the first troop and only troop on this entire list, as well as the only troop in the entire game that I do not currently own. I do have the material to go craft this. I could literally craft it right now if I wanted to. However, we don't currently know exactly how often they're going to be adding boss troops into this game. Obviously, that's a new thing kind of coming with these season things that happen every several months or a couple months. But we don't know exactly what the rate of boss-like troops are going to be coming into the game. And now that they made it so there's a 1% chance to get power orbs off of major orbs, there's a lot of concern in that we don't really know what the rate will be. So, we could get 2 per year, we could get 3 per year, who knows, it might even start doing it every season, though probably not. But we don't really know the interval in which they're really going to be happening. And for that reason, since power orbs are still pretty scarce, I don't want to craft it quite yet, because there's a good chance that the other mythics will be, or the other Doom rarity troops or boss rarity troops, whatever you want to call these red border troops, might end up becoming better. However, it is still a pretty decent option. I do feel like Carandera, or normal Carandera, is actually better than this thing. Main thing really holding this back is probably the very obvious one that we're staring at right now. He has a 35 mana cost. That alone, doesn't matter if his abilities kill everything instantly. That is a super, super high mana cost. But nonetheless, as far as this ability, it deals 41 damage, or same base damage as normal Carandera, except it hits all enemies. Same with that 10 times boost ratio. So if you have 5 Doom Skulls on the board, boom, that's like a 90 something. We were possibly even 100 with other boosts and everything. So you're hitting for quite a bit of damage to all enemies. And then it converts all yellows to gems, or sorry, all yellow gems to Doom Skulls, and then conjures a Doomstorm. So basically, as far as its ability, it's the exact same as normal Carandera, except it hits all enemies simultaneously instead of 1. However, it has a 9 higher mana cost to do so. Where it has, 11 higher mana cost, where it has a 20 or 35 instead of a 24. I think the other one was 24. Whatever the difference is, it has a 35. But anyways, as far as his links, as I mentioned, he's one of only 2. Carandera being the other one that has a link, not counting Queen. And aside from that, is actually the only mythic or above, or really only realistic troop that is currently player owns that has Invulnerable. So one interesting thing about Invulnerable is it does actually have immune to transform and to lethal, meaning that you can't instant kill this, which makes instant kills weaker, like Ubistet and stuff like that as well. But basically, this is, as we get more and more of these, this increasingly nerfs things that have instant kills attached to them, of course. But as far as this, yeah, it has the unique aspect of immune to transform and lethal, which basically nothing else in the game has currently in the game other than the 6 Dooms as far as player-owned stuff is concerned. And obviously the 6 Dooms you pretty much never use, so this is basically the only one. On top of that, he does have a curse. However, his curse is a little bit clunkier. He has a 40% chance to curse all enemies at the beginning of every single one of your turns, so you can't just extra turn spam for it on your very first turn. If you need it on your very first turn, you kind of just have to get lucky and just hope you already get it off that 40%, because if you don't, you can't just extra turn spam for it. So this can in some cases be better if you're kind of falling behind, but also in many cases can be worse because you can't just brute force it to happen. You have to deliberately wait for turns to go by if you didn't already end up getting it. Given how high his mana cost is, you're probably going to have to be waiting that long anyways. By the time he can cast his ability, you've probably already cursed the entire enemy team, but still, it's not as consistent as being able to hit it onto extra turns, and for that reason, he's generally not going to be used for his final trait. If you're using him, unlike Carandera, you're using him primarily for his ability, not for his traits, whereas the other way around, you're using Carandera mostly for its ability, its final trait, rather than its ability. But yeah, he's ability focused. Normal Carandera is trait focus. Though Invulnerable, still a really good trait, but there are very few instances where you can specifically use the immune to transform or lethal. So not as many instances where it can end up actually working. Also, if I'm not mistaken, it does not work against Zugoffs, or player-owned Zugoffs, it should. But specifically the Zugoff in raids, I don't believe this actually works against the invulnerable thingy, because I know it doesn't with the Doom, so I'm pretty sure it doesn't work with this either. A player-owned Zugoff it would, but a non-player-owned Zugoff, when you're doing it through the raid event, it would not work for. So do be mindful of that. Anyways, on to the next one. We have Infernus, another one of those that kind of fell quite a bit similar to that of Ubistet. But as far as Infernus, still an insanely good, well-rounded troop. As far as this is starting to become worse and worse, something being overall good, well-rounded, just because as we keep getting more and more troops into the game, we're starting to get increasingly more focused on what each troop can specifically do. So they're starting to get really, really specific as far as what roles they can serve. And now everything that kind of just does a general bit of everything is starting to become a little bit weaker. Even Titan is starting to feel this a little bit, even though it's still an insanely good hero class that you can literally use for everything. And Infernus still holds. You could even still craft Infernus as one of your first 5 mythics if you truly wanted to. However, his overall viability, particularly later in the game, due to Zugoff, is kind of going down. But as far as what he has, of course, he has Firestorm when an enemy dies, which is okay, which synergizes with the fact that he uses red, of course. One of his main stole gimmicks that he has is the 4x burn. Simply take an extra turn, you're good to go. This is obviously really good with all the hero classes that do triple damage to burning enemies. And aside from that, he still has a pretty good well-rounded ability. He ends up doing a bunch of splash damage to 2 random enemies. Unfortunately, you don't get to target, but it does get mana accumulation, so you get 5 explosions. So not only are you getting mana accumulation, but you have a chance of getting extra turn. Also, it does count as an elemental, and elementals are the strongest typing in the entire game as it currently stands, so it has a lot of potential with that, in that you can just half mana start it, build it with a bunch of other elementals, do it with a Mirage Queen, and kind of be good to go, and end up using it that way. Next up on our list, we have ourselves the Amarak. So Amarak's a bit of a weird one. It has the potential to auto-win, and it also has the potential of being horrible. It's one of those extremely luck-based options, which if it was to work properly, it'd be like S+ tier, but since it generally doesn't, it's a bit lower than that. I put it on B tier, of course. As far as its traits, it does have a stun burn. It's not a 4x stun burn, but it does get to stun burn a single enemy. It is pretty good because not only do you get to stun any kind of score reduction troops, you also get them burned. So if you're using a triple damage burning hero class, you not only don't have to worry about their agile or stone skin or anything like that for your their reduction, but you'll also end up having the burn for the triple damage. So you end up getting their trait stuns while also still having the triple damage burning. So that ends up working out pretty well. His ability ends up doing damage to an enemy, and there's a % chance that it'll devour them, boosted by red gems and burning enemies. So basically, for every single red gem and burning enemy that there is in play, it has a 4% chance to end up getting a devour. So let's say there's a total of 10 red gems combined with burning enemies on the board. This will end up being a total of a 42% chance to end up getting it. So if it was like 2 burning enemies and 10 reds on the board, that'd be something like a 50% chance that would end up getting a devour onto the opposing team, which is actually pretty standard. That's about how many you would have in a given time that you try going for it. And the main gimmick that it has is if the enemy ends up dying, it creates 9 red. So if it can end up getting this % chance to kill, and then those 9 red feed all the way back to full mana, you could theoretically go cast this kill, cast kill, cast kill, cast kill within like 30 seconds. Obviously, it is very, very rarely going to be lucky enough to actually land at. However, it is something it can do, so it is technically a mechanic it has. Generally, you're not really going to be using this. If you are, it is an elemental, so yes, it is all in that elemental meta with all the Mirage Queen and everything, so you can kind of go down that route with it. Overall, I personally feel like I never touch this thing. However, it's not a bad troop. It's just a really luck-based troop that generally you'd want to go for more consistent options rather than using that. Anyways, let's go down to Wardbreaker. So Wardbreaker's biggest issue, really high mana costs. Wardbreaker, where are you? There he is. Oh, of course, the Wardbreaker. That's why I can't find you. Another one that does. But anyways, he has basically a Gorgoltha amount of explosions. I like how I always compared to Gorgoltha. He's not as meta these days, but he used to be the comparison option. I still compare it to him. But anyways, he has the Gorgoltha amount of explosions. 18, that's basically a full board clear, pretty close to it. It gets to hit all enemies. Him, similar to most of the other dragons, main thing that made them fall off is Submerge. There's a lot of things that have Submerge, and even just Submerge existing in the game has just made them a lot weaker, given that if the opposing team has Submerge, well, they don't really get to do anything with full AoEs. That's the main thing holding him back. However, he does get pretty good value. He gets almost, it takes him a little while to get going because of his 30 mana cost. However, he gets a lot of that mana back, and he gets to hit everything simultaneously, so he still gets a lot of value out of it. Aside from that, he does get to gain some random skills every single time he extra turns. Overall, you're mostly using him for his ability, though, if you're using him. Overall, not the greatest of options. However, he once you get him going, he kind of stays going, and if you do it with like Bronze Duck Pistol and a couple other things, there's a couple different builds, like with Cedric and a couple other things they can kind of end up doing with it that are okay. Overall, a little bit more towards average, slightly above average, but still has its instances where it can be usable, with the main thing holding him back being Submerge and his super high mana cost. Anyways, next up on our list, we got ourselves Famine. So Famine, main gimmick with him, of course, is still the 4x mana drain. This hasn't really changed. He does have a 24 mana cost, though. Very wish he would have gotten his buff to 20 mana costs. There's actually almost all the Apocalypse troops, not all of them, end up basically getting a buff, and he was not one of them, unfortunately, when they ended up getting it a couple weeks ago. But basically, he 4x mana drains the entire enemy team, and he also gets to concentrate a bunch of damage to a single enemy. If the opposing team does not have any immune to mana drain, this is actually a pretty good option for keeping a lead. He's not good at winning quickly, but he's really good at winning. So generally, whenever you use him and the opposing team does not have any immune to mana drain, you could always keep the lead on them by simply having a little bit of mana accumulation expansion off of Beechurch or something similar, get all of your mana for Famine, and just kind of keep constantly draining down their mana to nothing. So they basically will never get a cast on you, or very rarely will end up getting a cast on you. You can also do with cheaper options like Cockatrice and stuff like that, and Apothecary and all that good stuff. But overall, pretty good. Doesn't have Jinx anymore, which it used to a couple years back. So overall, its traits are completely abysmal. It's pretty much only used for its ability in the current state of the game. So next up, we have ourselves Aquaticus. So Aquaticus, it's okay. It has 4x Submerge. Main gimmick it has, quickest submerge that you can really get to your entire team. Generally, you're going to use a hero class that can submerge one at a time just because it has better overall value as far as what you can end up using it with a rope dart and everything else. Not to mention it even shares the same color, so generally you're going to just be using a rope dart hero class that happens to have submerge instead if you need this mechanic. However, as far as Aquaticus itself, it's not horrible. It does some light splash damage, which is 25% to adjacents, and it gets this down 3 times. It also gets to explode half the blue gems on the board. Biggest issue with this is it is dependent on blue. So unlike things like Infernus and stuff like that, it is dependent specifically on a color. However, this also means it could potentially get a lot more of it. So just like 14 blues on the board, it will get 7 explosions, and compared to Infernus, which only gets 5. However, this is generally overall a bad thing just because it's lower inconsistency. The blues could be clumped up a little bit more together, as well as the fact that if they deny the blue, well, you're kind of out of luck. So you can't really use this necessarily on a blue Guild War day, or at least as effectively, just because you're going to be hard countered whenever they start removing your blue. So things to consider with her. However, she is still overall pretty good and still technically the best submerger in the game, even though hero class 1 submerge at a time is generally the better option with something like rope dart or similar if you're looking for the color option, but still technically the quickest submerge if you need it to counter a full AoE or other similar mechanics that are going to be doing things that you need to counter with submerge. Anyways, next up is Scorpius and Oriali, which basically are attached to each other at this point. But as far as Scorpius and Oriali, Scorpius, this used to be so much better prior to the when the happening to Urskea, because now Urskea, ever since the Caranderas, has immune to poison now, which end up making it quite a bit less effective to end up running. But anyways, as far as Scorpius, it has double instant kill, the main thing that's really good to be using. It has double instant kill to poisoned enemies. This I still feel like in the current state of the game is actually better than Ubistet, at least in the sense that if you can get the team down to a point where there is no immune to poison, either by using a curse option or just other options in general, like by them, just not having immune to poison to begin with, you can still get the double kill into the double kill. And I feel like it's overall a bit more consistent than that of Ubistet in the current state of the game, even now. But overall, there's just a lot more immune to poison, so it's becoming harder to do without having to specifically have a curse. If we ever get like a consistent curse poison added to the game, this thing is going to go like all the way up to like S tier again. Actually, it might even become like ultra meta again. However, as it currently stands, it doesn't exist, but do keep an eye on him. Scorpius is definitely a trip to keep an eye on, as while he was better in the past, and he does have potential to be really good again. So we just have to wait till more options come into the game. They will eventually make him very broken again. Just wait. He will once be good again, but as it currently stands, I personally wouldn't really bother with Scorpius too much in the current state of the game. And Oriali has a really similar problem. Oriali is normally used as the poison option for it. Still best poison for 4x poison. There are other ways to do it, but as far as extra turn is concerned, it also has a okay amount of true damage overall. Not the greatest, but it does have a backup summon, which also has Skull Reflect, which can end up working out pretty good against Skull Spammers, because if they end up doing a one actually weird gimmick that this has is if they do a really big amount of skull spam and you have that 25% reflect, it can sometimes overcompensate how much damage they did. So they'll basically just kill themselves off the 25% skull reflect. Obviously, they would have to hit for a very high amount, but it still sometimes overcompensates as far as the amount of reflect that it ends up doing. So even something like Bone Naga's 25% reflect can end up going a pretty far away. And if I'm not mistaken, she's the only thing that consistently summons something that has, or at least as far as Mythics are concerned anyways. I can't remember if there's another one. But she can consistently summon something that has this 25% reflect. I believe there is actually one other Mythic that does. It's not Mother of Darkness, but it's Queen of Sin that does it. However, it's a 50% chance because it's mixed between 2 different troops, Wrath and Lust. So it's only a 50% chance that he gets it. So yeah, it's the only Mythic, I believe, as well, the only troop in the game, that 100% chance has a skull reflect option, which there's utility purposes for it. Very rarely would you bring this out, but it is pretty strong in those skull spam counter instances where you do need to bring it out. Anyways, next up, Def. Def actually got a pretty substantial buff pretty recently. It got its mana cost reduced from, I believe, 24 down to 20. It was either 22 or 24 before, but it's now 20. So basically, his main premise is he gets... also, I believe they might have buffed his boost ratio. I think it might have been 1 to 3 earlier, and now it's 1 to 2, so it does a little bit more damage that way. But anyways, as far as its ability, it does Death Mark to all enemies, which Death Mark's still not the greatest. However, now that it can do it for a lower mana cost and still has that boost ratio based on life, it can end up getting a decent amount of value here and there. Basically, you go and get a bunch of life gain, and you can end up going and doing a bunch of scatter, which can end up concentrating its damage, and then you also get the Death Marks, and as those Death Marks start getting kills, your scatter damage starts to concentrate more and more on whatever's left, so it can end up getting some pretty substantial amount of damage. If it has something like 200 life, you're basically hitting for like about 150 or so, and after you've already gotten a kill, that can end up concentrating quite a bit as the Death Marks keep doing their kills. Overall, Death Mark, pretty inconsistent ability overall within the game. However, it's still a strong ability. It can still kill out of nowhere, and while not the most consistent, it is still viable. Anyways, next up we got ourselves Undyne. As far as Undyne is concerned, he's mostly used as a blue counter and pretty much just that. He deals damage to an enemy and to the one below, and is boosted by all merfolk and submerged allies, and then submerges all blue allies and silences all blue enemies. As far as blue counters are concerned, obviously if you're trying to counter a team that has a lot of blue, you're generally going to be using something like the Grey King. However, this is still really good if you're using like AI control, so if you want to set it for blue Guild War defend. It can also still be good on against blue teams if you don't have something like a Grey King yet. Overall, it's pretty much just a blue counter essentially, but it has a way to blue counter in a way that the AI will always do it correctly, since it's forced to do it correctly, unlike a Grey King, which might incorrectly do its ability. So even though it has a bit of a weird ability and is overall quite a bit weaker than Grey King in its versatility when it's player owned, it is quite a bit better when it's AI controlled, and it's still a factor when considering Guild War defense and stuff like that. So in that regard, still pretty good. And it still has some merfolk synergies that you can end up doing with stuff like Megavore and stuff like that if you want to end up utilizing it that way. And anyways, as far as the last thing in B tier, we got ourselves, and also halfway through the list, imagine this is halfway. And then we got Jasmine's Chosen. So this deals scatter damage boosted by entangled enemies, which doesn't really help too much, and then creates a bunch of green. Basically, this is a weaker version of Wild Queen in pretty much every single way. It still has its viability just because it can loop a little bit, and it does still have its entangle random enemy when matching green, which, given the fact that it creates green, is pretty much entangle entire enemy team once you get it going, because that's essentially what it's going to do. Still feels a little weak at times, but it's still technically a 4x entangle option, and it still has potential loop potential. Compared to things like Truffle, Beatrix, stuff like that, it's kind of getting outclassed by those. However, it can still have synergy with them. Overall, compared to Wild Queen, I don't feel like you'd really touch this. However, it's not a completely useless option, but in comparison is quite weak. Anyways, let's go bring the list back up. So we're now all the way down to C tier. So of course, everything below this point still usable. Pretty much everything, almost any mythic can, under the right circumstance, still be usable. However, we are starting to get to stuff that are a lot more situational, a lot weaker in many situations, and or just are falling off in many ways within the game. Anyways, let's go and get into the first one, which I actually completely forget her name. Let's see. Hunting. That's the only problem with so many mythics existing in the game now, is I'm already bad with names, and now they're making it even worse because all the dead content or recently added content, I keep forgetting their names, which is obviously right there. Okay. So of course we got this at the end of season 2. So she's used mostly for utility purposes. She has quite a bit of Death Mark spam similar to Def. However, I do consider her a bit worse than Def ever since Def got that buff. But it does Def Mark a random enemy whenever you extra turn, so you can 4x Def Mark that way. However, do keep in mind, if you put a Def Mark on something that's already Def Marked, it will refresh the 1-turn delay in which you can't kill it. And aside from that, its ability kind of synergizes with that a little bit. It deals damage to an enemy boosted by Def Marked enemies, which you can end up getting potentially, of course, 40 additional damage off of. And then curses and diseases all enemies, with the curse disease helping quite a bit. Disease making sure they can't get their cast off as quickly, and the curse making sure that the Def Mark stays on them for a longer duration, basically hoping that you end up getting the Def Mark kill, which of course is our whole premise, is to try to get those Def Mark kills. Very RNG based character, plays very similarly to Def except without the boost ratio off of life, and overall not as good as Def. However, there are situations where you would end up bringing it out due to the fact that she has curse specifically attached to herself, so you can kind of get the curse Def Mark that way, and some team synergies might end up being overall better, especially if you want to throw a stun or an iron gut, or some kind of other mechanic that you might need the curse specifically for, where you might not need to necessarily go the other way around when you're doing Def. Anyways, next up, Ubistet. So Ubistet used to be S tier at one point in the game. Dragon's Eye ends up getting nerfed a lot, multiple times, like 2 or 3 times. which ended up making him quite a bit worse. He also ended up getting his boost ratio at one point nerfed from a 4-to-1 to a 6-to-1, which substantially decreased his chance of actually being able to secure kills, which was also a really huge hit to him. Prior to that, he could pretty much always consistently get it. Now it's quite a bit harder. Even with a rope dart, he sometimes doesn't have the damage output to end up getting the kill. The other big issue he has is once he ends up securing his double kill, his second double kill, if that's your main damage option, is going to be way harder to end up landing because you just got rid of 2 whole enemies, and if you're boosting primarily off their stats, you know, their attacks specifically, it's going to be super hard to end up landing the second one, whereas the first one you might get a little bit easy. The second one you're generally going to miss, and in some instances you can even miss both of them depending on the kind of battle that you end up doing. Just overall, just really hard to set up into in the current state of game. There are much easier setups to end up using. Even Scorpius in the current state of game, I would say, is easier to double kill setup compared to Ubistet in the current state of game. And overall, he just really lost his charm. He used to be so good. Arguably the absolute best troop at one point in the game, but he is just falling so hard. He's still usable if you have him and you still want to mess around with him. Mostly rope dart, obviously, as far as build, as far as getting them down into kill range. But if you can't get a rope dart into Ubistet, there's no point in casting him. If that combo does not kill, whatever you're currently using him for is just not worth it compared to a different option. But overall, still usable, just very situational, and there's a lot of other options within the game that can double kill better between Zugoff, between Scorpius, between even Lord of Slaughter in a sense, if you kind of consider that as like a double kill option, which it normally can. There's just other better options in the game that just makes him really bad. He also falls off quite a bit in stuff like PvP and stuff. He's still mostly a Delph troop if you're going to use him, but even that is just so situational compared to other options. Anyways, next up we have Vashtagan. Vashtagan, very weird troop. They still have not fixed the glitch with him, and I'm not sure if they're ever going to fix the glitch with him. I'm not even sure if they even realize there's still a glitch with him. But for whatever reason, they fixed it with Black Beast a while back. But basically, whenever he tries to devour an ally, if they have barrier, it won't devour them because they forgot to add in Invisible Dispel. They did this correctly with Black Beast ages back. However, they have not done this simple change to Vashtagan yet. I think the main issue with this might be the fact that he does damage to the opposing team as well, so it might try dispelling the entire enemy team. But I still feel like that would be fine if he dispelled both the thing he targeted and the entire enemy team. That'd be perfectly fine. It's not like he's overpowered or anything. But yeah, he's basically worse than Black Beast in many situations due to how his ability is basically blocked by barrier. And very rarely can he actually end up getting much value from this. He does have a random Daemon summon, which sometimes he can summon something good, sometimes he can summon something with immune to devour, and you're kind of out of luck. So it's just really inconsistent with what it does. It does end up doing true damage, so it has that going for it. It's also boosted by its life, so if you end up getting a bunch of life boost ratio, it kind of be it actually has a very similar premise to that of Death, actually, as far as its boost ratio is kind of concerned, except it does true damage instead of physical, but it has a lower boost ratio. Aside from that, generally if you're going to be using it, you're using it for his Impervious combined with the fact that he has Curse on Brown. There are a lot of things that spam a lot of Brown, as we've already mentioned, and being able to get a Curse every single time you do can be pretty good value, and if you're already spamming a lot of Brown, you can pretty much get 4 times Curse for free within a single turn. So that's one of the main reasons you would use it, kind of as a synergy for something like Iron Gut or something similar, but overall, just not really that good. Speaking of things not too good, Voice of Orpheus, there's just much better cleanses. However, the main gimmick that Voice of Orpheus has, and one of the reasons it's not all the way down on this list, even though I don't think I've used it in like over a year, is it's the only troop in the entire game as it currently stands that has immune to silence while also having cleanse. This used to be a lot more common with all the imperviouses that existed within the game. However, the fact that it has immune to stun, immune to silence, all this stuff together while still having the cleanse ends up working out pretty good. Something like Beatrix, which is the best cleanser currently within the entire game, gets hard countered the second it gets stunned. However, something like Voice of Orpheus doesn't get countered by that. You can get stunned, you can get silenced, you can get whatever, and you're still going to have the cleanse by simply taking a single yellow from the board. You're generally not going to be using this on Yellow Guild War because, of course, they're going to deny your yellow. However, there are some instances where if they're running a lot of disable and you just need a way to get out of it, you could just end up taking a single yellow and pretty much be good to go with Voice of Orpheus. Its ability is basically a weaker version of Famine in every single way. Really wish they would have made its boost ratio a little bit better. It just really does not get that much damage. It also does not boost ratio off of its own mana. It might seem like it might, but it does not. So all that 22 mana that you have, you do not get boost ratio from. There's quite a few troops that end up not getting boost ratio from their own thing, like when they have their own Submerge or their own Enchant and stuff like that. But this thing doesn't even get boost ratio off its own mana. So this makes it quite a bit weaker weaker, and basically makes every cast it does 22 damage weaker. Overall, still needs quite a bit of tweaks before it really ever becomes viable, but it does occasionally have its impervious into cleanse kind of aspect that it can ever so occasionally use, but it is exceedingly situational to the point that you would almost never really bring it out. Anyways, next up is Suna, and I'm not going to confuse it for Phoenicia this time. So Suna, as far as Suna, it's actually somewhat decent in early game. It's actually a really good Queen of Tanya alternative until then. However, it's basically outclassed by Queen of Tanya once you get Queen of Tanya. However, there are some people that actually have Suna and not Queen of Tanya. I know I actually did have it on Switch, and I have heard some people mention that as well in the past, that they actually have a Suna but they don't have Queen of Tanya. It happens sometimes. It's not likely to, but it can happen. But basically, Queen of Tanya is better than it in pretty much every single way. However, if you are going to be using it, it does have a double lifesteal. And you do get to keep that life. It does have a double magic gain as well, so you can end up getting 16 more magic for it every single time. This obviously a lot better earlier into the game than later into the game, and you can basically just keep stacking life, keep stacking magic, and get pretty beefy over time. However, the problem is it takes a lot of time for it to get rolling, and for that reason, it's not as good. It also can Fairy Fire quite a bit, but compared to Queen of Tanya's Fairy Fire, it's normally a better option. But she can Fairy Fire a random enemy every single time you take red gems, so you can end up getting quite a bit of value out of that by just spamming a bunch of reds, and not only does that feed back into her mana, of course, but she also ends up getting that. No board control or anything, though. Like many troops that are kind of lower down, if they don't end up getting that, that's kind of prevents them from doing quite a bit. Anyways, overall, just basically a weaker version of Queen of Tanya, even though she's a mythic, and the other one is not. Anyways, we got ourselves the, gosh, I forgot his name too. Wolf Garrick. No, not Wolf Garrick. The other one. The other one that's like Wolf Garrick, Doomclaw. So this thing does a double devour. It does damage to an enemy boosted by Enrage allies, which generally you're not using it for that aspect, and then has two separate 25% chances to devour the next enemy above and below. So basically you target a enemy and the one above below and have a 25% chance of being devoured. Keep in mind, unlike Charm, this does account for gaps. So let's say you target a third slot and there's nothing in second slot. It'll still have a chance to devour first slot and fourth slot, even though it skipped over second, because it does retroactively skip over it. However, if you target something like fourth slot, it'll only do one devour chance. It'll be onto third. But if you do something like third and there's a gap on second, it will still hit all the way to first. Or if, of course, there's second, third, fourth, and there's no gap there, it'll, of course, have the chance to devour second and the chance to devour fourth. But it does retroactively account for gaps. However, that's not enough to make it viable. It's basically just two 25% chances. It can theoretically double devour, even though that's very rare. However, generally you're going to get no devour when you need it, and it's just going to feel very bad. It's one of those extremely luck-based mythics that you're almost never really going to be using just because of how luck-based it is. One mechanic that it does have that can occasionally be used is Enrage a random ally on 4x, 5x matches. The fact that this doesn't auto-enrage first slot makes it a little bit weaker in the sense that generally your first slot's the thing that you want to enrage unless you're using Enrage boost ratio. However, his Enrage boost ratio isn't really good enough to really justify having an Enrage on a random thing just to use. So overall, pretty bad troop, and generally it's not really going to be used. Anyways, next on our list, we got War, the very first mythic ever added to the game. Fun fact, it was the very, very first mythic when they first started releasing mythics. Obviously, the game is called Gems of War, and what first mythic to add than War? One other pretty interesting thing, they actually buffed him. I believe he had a 22 mana cost earlier, and now he has a 20 mana cost. They ended up buffing him the other week when they ended up doing a bunch of rebounds to the game. It wasn't enough to make him viable, but he got a buff nonetheless. So you only need 20 mana cost now to cast him. But basically, he burns all enemies. Of course, there's a bunch of things that can do this much better, and he ends up dealing damage to an enemy boosted by his attack, so whatever his attack is, he gets a 1-to-1 ratio off it, and he gains an extra turn if the enemy dies. Obviously, the main premise with this is like feed an attack with Earth's Fury, go and he gets ability, and just one-shot everything, ideally, and kind of go from there where you one-shot, 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 one-shot. This is a little bit easier now to do. Now that he has a 20 mana cost, however, it just takes a lot of setup to get it going, and overall, just better options out there, and not really a gimmick you'd bother with. It's a gimmick that you can use if you want to mess around with it for fun, but there's really no reason to. Anyways, next up, Tanya, he was another one that got buffed. He got his mana cost reduced down to 20 as well. Whereas before, I believe it was also 22. But he does Heavy Splash, which does 75% to adjacents. It stuns every single thing that it touches. And he also gets to do double damage if his attack is greater. So this is pretty useful for concentrating a bunch of damage if you're trying to go for like a second slot, fourth slot. Kind of runs a little bit like Ketris, except you get to throw some stuns with it. Generally, you're going to be using Obsidius if you want to stun, but he does have some backup summon. Overall, there's just better options for stunning, and generally, you're not really going to be using him for his damage output, as he doesn't have any board control from his ability, even even though he does gets a little bit of resummon with it. It doesn't have any specific board control, and overall just isn't really going to help that much. Anyways, next up we got Elamagrim. So as far as Elamagrim, we actually got another troop kind of like Elamagrim, which I already forgot its name. It's Ishtara, but we got that one. But they also end up getting a buff in the most recent balance changes. They now have a 9 gem spawn as default instead of an 8. This actually helps Elamagrim quite a bit more than the other one, because this now allows it to create 13, whereas the other one can still only create 12 because it can't boost ratio off itself with a blast because it goes away. But yeah, you can now get a 13 purple spam with Elamagrim, which makes him a little bit better, which is pretty much why he's in C tier. Otherwise, he'd probably be in D tier. But yeah, he can end up creating 13 purple if the entire opposing team is burning. Biggest issue with this and all dragons and pretty much everything that hits full AoE is the fact that he hits full AoE and hits all enemies simultaneously. This is pretty bad against Submerge, obviously, because he can't do anything against Submerge. And a team like this generally can't really fit Curse because, well, you need Burning instead, since he doesn't have Burning that you can end up using yourself. He does still have the attack steal thing. This is, of course, becoming increasingly less effective as the game goes on, but he still can reduce the enemy's attack down. So if you get a lot of extra turns, it kind of chips their attack down to pretty much nothing, and he does have Impervious. But overall, it just takes so much setup just to get him going that you're generally just going to be using some kind of other different option. There's also no way to mana star him because he's a dragon and daemon, neither of which have 50% mana start in the current state of the game. He might become viable once that becomes a thing, once we get like a good curse burn simultaneous, if we ever get something like that properly. But until then, until we get like a good 50% start with curse burn, it's going to be a while before he's really going to have any kind of potential within the game. Next up, Amnesia. Pretty much has always been bad, but it does a bunch of attack and life gain to Daemons every single turn. And aside from that, for 22 mana cost, ends up exploding a bunch of mana on the board for a pretty high amount of mana cost compared to other exploders that could do it for way cheaper. And then as summoning in Inferno King. One thing that Inferno King can do as a summon, of course, is constantly keep summoning itself. Has a 25% chance to summon itself every single time. So this troop can be very annoying, though generally isn't really that effective. It's just really effective at being very annoying. And that's about it. It doesn't really have much effect as far as actually being good. Anyways, as far as Champion of Anu, the last thing that we have placed onto C tier. So Champion of Anu, it has a silence, stun, and drain all the mana from whatever it targets, and then also gets to do damage to that enemy as well as all enemies below them. So generally how you're going to use this obviously is target first slot, and then it hits the entire enemy team, and the first slot gets silenced, stunned, and drained. Of course, you can target whatever you want. However, you will only damage specifically the thing that you target and everything below. So it's just not a standard AoE. It does have 60% score reduction, which is decently solid, and it does have that +1 to all blues per turn, but overall, not really much going for it. Doesn't really have any kind of board control or anything. Does get to have that little bit of advantage by doing a little bit of mana drain and everything. But overall, pretty average. Just kind of something that I would use, kind of incorporate into a bit of a blue team with some knights and just kind of having it there. But overall, not really something you would really touch much. Anyways, next up, we are going to be getting now into D tier. So everything here, still under the right circumstance, could theoretically be used. Or starting to get to the point where almost everything here fourth you would almost never really touch unless it's like so ridiculously situational, or if you're wanting to mess around with it or something. But yeah, let's start getting into them. So as far as D tier, we got ourselves Queen Aurora, something that I actually used to use quite a bit in the past, but they ended up doing a nerf about 2 years ago where traits can't multi-trigger, and this actually ended up nerfing Rainbow Link a lot, because her Rainbow Link can no longer multi-trigger. So let's say you take a green and a brown simultaneously, like literally simultaneously as you swipe in them exact same time, as in they were right adjacent to each other, like you're taking a 3 into a 3, just combining right in together at the exact same time. If you do this, you'll only get Link for one and not the other. Priority is based on the mastery screen, like on that one screen, but I believe they still have not fixed this to this day. It's a little bit hard to test because it's actually very situational when that ends up happening on the board. But yeah, it just doesn't really trigger properly anymore, and this ended up nerfing it quite heavily because the whole premise of it was to do that, and now it very rarely does that. Like if you get a cascade, like if you get a green into a brown into a red, it'll still work, but if you take them both exactly simultaneously, it'll no longer get you that extra link for every single one like that. So it's kind of broken in that regard, and not broken in a good way, broken in a like it doesn't even function properly way. So unfortunately, stuff like Possessed King and stuff like that ends up getting much better value from their final trait. The other big issue she has is her final trait, or her ability, does not actually trigger on herself. She gives all other allies a bunch of life and creates some gems and buries them. But she doesn't do this to herself. If she did this to herself, she'd still be pretty bad. If she did this to herself and gave cleanse to all allies, she could probably become viable again. as well as if they lowered it to like 20 mana cost. But she needs quite a few tweaks. But that's all she'd really need. Slightly lower mana costs, have the effect applied to herself, and do cleanse to all allies. If those were applied to her, she'd definitely be usable in the current state of game. But unfortunately, she doesn't have those things. And between just all the factors, the fact that she doesn't do that to herself for a really high mana cost for what she does, and the fact that this doesn't really work properly in some situations, just basically makes her all the way down in D tier, even though she used to be quite a bit higher in the past. Anyways, next up on our list, we got ourselves Skady. Skady, there just really isn't much of a point in using Mana Burn in the game. Mana Burn, at one point when Queen Mab had it and there was no immune to it, was pretty strong. But ever since they had immune to it, became a lot weaker. And then they added this thing, and it just didn't really ever seem good. And still isn't really. It does have Perpetual Blue Storm. However, Jar of Eyes, even though it got nerfed, is still basically a better Perpetual Blue Storm than using Skady, oddly enough. But she gets to freeze and Mana Burn the first two enemies. Mana Burn doing damage based on how much mana they currently have, unless they have immune. And it knocks them to the last position. So a little bit of a repositioning thing. However, the reposition is really predictable. So unless you really specifically needed those first two all the way to the back, you might not necessarily go for it. And also recasting it again would put them right back where they were. So if you cast it twice, you're literally right back to where you were. So it doesn't really help too much in that regard. But it also gets to summon a Queen Mab. Queen Mab, of course, used to be quite a bit better, though in the current state of game, pretty underwhelming compared to other better freeze options between the Frostfire Mage as well as just using Frost Mage hero class itself. And other than that, it's mostly just used for Perpetual Blue Storm. And honestly, unless you're specifically using it for Perpetual Blue Storm, you're almost never going to be touching Skady in the current state of game. And due to Jar of Eyes, you're pretty much never needing her for Perpetual Blue Storm because Jar of Eyes normally does it better, even after its nerf. So there just isn't really much of a point. Anyways, King Thorn, or whatever his name is, Thorn something, where are you? I know you're in here. Wild Thorn. Wait, it might be called Wild Thorn, actually. I can't remember your name because you're not meta at all, so I never need to actually search for your name. King Wild Thorn, or Bloodwood. Somewhere's around there. Good. But anyway, as far as what he does an Entangle Bleed. So he has basically Entangle Bleed whenever he ends up taking an extra turn. Only hits one of them, though. There's better Entangles out there. There's better Bleeds, specifically Mother of Darkness, of course. And even Slayer hero class in some situations. But overall, not really too much value there. Its ability is just a heavy splash, and it's boosted by Entangles, kind of pretty similar boost ratio to quite a few other Mythics out there. And it also gets to steal a bunch of life from all the enemies. Overall, pretty average. Everything about it's pretty average. Doesn't get any kind of board control or anything like that. Just average in pretty much every single way. And for that reason, just isn't really that valuable. Draculus, one of those troops that actually at one point was really meta, but in the current state of game, not so much. He has a 20 mana cost these days, steals a bunch of life from all enemies, and that's literally it. It's basically like an Uriali without any benefit. It's basically a Uriali with like no additional benefit. Like, he's essentially in the current state of the game a weaker version of Uriali. He does technically have 50% undead start now, but why wouldn't you just use Grey King instead in many of these situations? So, I don't know. He's just outclassed by, like, everything. He's seen better days. He, at one point, was actually meta. And when I say one point, I mean, like, gosh, 4 years ago? It was very early in the Mythic cycles with, like, Crimson Bat into Draculus. But he's definitely not anymore, that's for sure. And overall, he might actually be F tier, actually. Why is he in D tier? He might actually be in F tier. Go down to D tier, or go back to F. But yeah, he's pretty bad. I actually forgot how bad he was. I knew he was bad. I forgot he was that bad in the current state of the game. He has kind of like the, you know what happened to him? He has the Lady Anuriel, or not Lady Anuriel. He has the Lady Sapphira effect, where Lady Sapphira, like 5.5 years ago, or almost 6 years ago at this point, was like the most meta thing in the entire game. Yet she wasn't touched, and now she's like the weakest epic like you get from any kingdom. And that's kind of what happened to Draculus, where like he just became so dead, even though he was perfectly meta at one point with pretty much that same premise. It just happens. Anyways, next up we got Storm Shield. Or he called the Storm Shield. Let's see. Is he not called Storm Shield? Yeah, Jotnar Storm Shield. Gosh, why? But anyways. He does a concentrated true damage. You'd kind of think he'd be a little bit better given that he's giant and he gets half mana start, but that's not really enough. He can barely even one-shot. He can't even get his one-shot down most of the time, which obviously is not good for something that's supposed to be one-shotting. But it's boosted based on barriered allies and giant allies, so you end up getting a little bit of boost ratio there for his true damage and ideally get a one-shot. However, that's all he really has is a one-shot true damage combined with a little bit of barrier here and there. Overall, pretty weak. Nothing you'd really end up using. Next up, we got ourselves the Flame of Anu. So as far as Flame of Anu is concerned, it deals damage to the first 2 enemies, boosted by Burning and Fairy Fire. This is actually weaker than one of the epics that are in the game that do damage to the first 2 enemies and burns and Fairy Fires them. He basically has the Burn and Fairy Fire specifically onto his final trait instead when he does extra turn spam. However, he doesn't have it attached to his ability anymore, which is kind of weird. Or, you know, not compared to the other troop, he doesn't have it attached to his ability. And just overall, it doesn't really do that much damage, and there's just better ways to go about Fairy Fire and Burning. It does have the combination together, which is kind of cool, but very rarely would you both need Fairy Fire and Burning in a given instance. Normally, you would need one or the other, the Burning to do triple damage to skulls, or the Fairy Fire to do better casting. And if you need Fairy Fire, you're generally going to go Queen of Tani, and if you need Burning, you're going to go Zugoff, you're going to go Infernus, you're going to go any of the many other Burning options that there are within the game, and you're not really going to be using Flame of Anu. It just isn't worth it to do it one at a time compared to doing them all simultaneously with the other options that exist within the game. So overall, just not really going to be used much. Anyways, next up is the other version of Elamagrim, which is weaker, which is the more recent one, the Arshtara. Basically, this does what Elamagrim does, but it does yellow, and it does it based on Bless. The problem with this is things like Bless and other similar things that when you end up having it on yourself and you end up casting, it actually gets removed before it gets boost ratio checked in the current state of game, meaning even if you had your entire team Blessed, instead of getting a 13 gem spawn, the most you could get is a 12, because the Bless on yourself will not actually count towards it. So they still have not fixed this in the current state of game. It has been a thing since SAS effects have existed, and yeah, who knows, maybe we'll get to it eventually. But even if they made that change, that wouldn't really help it much. It'll still be basically just as weak, but at least it'll be 1 gem better, if nothing else. It also did get a 1 gem buff pretty recently, and by pretty recently, I mean like literally a week ago. So it got that, but that was not enough, similar to the Elamagrim change to make it viable. So yeah, it's not viable. It does have the 50% chance to bless a random ally when its turn begins, though. So unlike Elamagrim, it does actually have its effect attached to itself. However, 50% chance to bless is by no means enough for it to do its entire boost ratio. And it's not even like per extra turn, it's just randomly. So yeah, it's not really going to help much. You're still going to need a blesser onto your team to even try to hope to get enough blesses to get it rolling. And even then, you're not really going to be able to do much with it because it doesn't bless based off itself for boost ratio. Anyways, next up, Xenos. Xenos actually did get ever so slightly indirectly buffed a little bit, though it's still pretty useless. It's mostly just used for the achievement that's associated with obtaining it. But basically this thing, it does count as undead, so it does have the ability to half mana start now. As far as what it does, steals a bunch of life and ends up gaining half its magic from the enemy. It has a very similar effect to that of Suna, except it concentrates all of its damage onto a single target, but steals a lot more when it does do its ability. So it's basically a Suna, but single target, but it scales way better over time. It also gets to summon 1 to 3 random undead if the enemy dies, so it constantly can keep getting new undeads. But overall, ever since the 50% undead buff, it's at least above F tier, if nothing else, so it has that going for it. But yeah, it's not really going to be doing anything too substantial. Nothing about it's particularly good. It's basically just an alternative version of Suna. That's a single target instead of double target. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. And it doesn't even have like Fairy Fire or anything. It doesn't get anything good off its final ability. Just a bunch of life and magic when an enemy dies. So nothing really too good. And it's only for undead as well, not even for your entire team. Anyways, next up is Stonehammer and the other very defensive one, the guard one. So these two actually got a buff recently in that they got a lower mana cost. Stonehammer used to have a 24 mana cost and got reduced down to 22. I believe it also got a slightly higher amount of gem spawn, or it might have just been the mana cost. But it stun and burns all enemies and then creates a mixture of red and browns and then gains a bunch of life. Still very useless. It does technically have the high score reduction in the game, however that's not enough to make it viable. And the things that have 65% reduction and 75% reduction with better abilities are just better to use, as well as this barrier spamming off a hero class that has barrier on brown. So overall, you're not really going to be using Stonehammer. And the other guy has the exact same problem. The what's his name of guard? The champion of guard. So as far as champion of guard, he has the exact same problem where he's super tanky, 60% score reduction, 50% spell reduction. In his case, he can actually be stunned. The other one can't even be stunned unless it gets curse stunned. But this, you just put 1 stun on it, you just lost all its tank ability, and you don't even get the extra stats or everything. But it basically just gains a bunch of armor, and then if there's 13 or more skulls, it also doubles the amount of armor, and it doesn't even use that armor for anything, so you're just gaining armor for the sake of gaining armor. It doesn't even do anything. And then it creates a mix of blue and red, kind of similar to the other one. This is even less offensive, because unlike having a stun and burn, which are both offensive options, it doesn't even have that. And it does do it for 20 mana cost instead of 22, if nothing else. However, it has nothing offensive about it at all. If it actually did something off its armor on literally anything, it could maybe be okay, but it doesn't, so it's bad. At least Tina 9000 can end up doing it for its spell reduction while still getting damaged and everything. This thing, I don't know, it just flops on everything and is basically just a inferior version of Dina 9000 in a sense if you're comparing it that way. Obviously with skull reduction, but it'll put a stun on it. Won't have that anymore. But overall, it's still really bad. These are both tanky troops that are supposed to be tanky that don't really serve their roles at all compared to just using Hero Classic and gain Barrier on Brown, or using Sentinel if you really need something super tanky for Hero. Anyways, next up, we got herself Queen of Sin. So as far as Queen of Sin is concerned, she ends up doing true damage to the first two enemies, and then summons a Wrath or a Lust. This was the troop I was referring to earlier with that 25% scroll reflect thingy. The biggest issue with this ability is that Wrath is a good first slot, whereas Lust is a good anywheres but first slot. So this is a little bit weird that generally as your front kind of dies out, that she has a summon like this. If she 100% of the time only summoned Wrath, she'd actually be insanely good. And even if she 100% of the time only summoned Lust, she'd still be usable, but in a slightly different way. But the fact that it's mixed between the two actually makes her weaker, not stronger. She also gets to bless all daemons, which can be okay if daemons ever became meta again, but they aren't. They very much aren't. Maybe if they get 50% mana start at some point. Enemies also lose 4 from a random skill point when an ally casts a spell, which you can kind of spam a little bit. However, this doesn't synergize much with her own ability because she doesn't have much spam ability on her own ability, so you don't end up getting to really utilize it too much. Overall, pretty bad. Not really that good. The only thing really keeping it alive is both those summons aren't horrible. So those summons alone almost kind of keep her viable, just in the sense that that summon, kind of like Amnesia in a sense, or like the summon alone. Like if it was just ability without the summon, both Amnesia and Queen of Sin would be like absolute at the bottom. But at least their summon kind of make them at least somewhat okay. And that's basically what Queen of Sin does. But since it doesn't have any board control or mana accumulation, quite a bit lower, and there's much better true damage options out there. Anyways, to finish it out, let's go to F tier, the absolute worst of the worst. So some things in D tier are kind of in that category as well. But anyways, these are all the things that generally you're not really going to be touching. If you're getting them, you're pretty much only getting them for kingdom upgrades. In the case of Plague, you can't even use it for a kingdom upgrade. And also put Sacred Treasure in there. Technically, it's a mythic. Obviously, it's the worst thing in the entire game is if you're counting as a mythic. But it is still technically a mythic, so I figured we'd count it. Anyways, let's go and get into them. So first thing first, Wolf Garrick. So Wolf Garrick, he's been bad forever. He's been buffed like 2 or 3 times, still useless. Wolf Garrick, where are you? W's. Wolf Garrick, biggest issue. He doesn't have enough damage on his ability to get things going. So he's one of those premises where you need to get a kill and he does something. A lot of these are kind of sketchy on if they're good or not, and Wolf Garrick's definitely one of several that is not good with it. He deals damage to an enemy, and then it's boosted by War Gear allies that are 4 times, which includes himself. Not nearly enough of a boost ratio. And if the enemy dies, it devours a random enemy. So not only do you not get to choose the devour location, but they can also have immune to devour, unlike instant kill things like Ubista and stuff like that. While things are starting to get immune to instant kill, a lot more things have immune to devour, of course. He does have impervious, and he does have a reworked trait that was reworked about a year or so ago, year and a half, I don't even know at this point. But he gives 2 attack and magic to allied war gears when matching 4 or more gems, so he can kind of stack his magic a little bit, but he still takes way too much setup to kind of get going, and compared to other options, you never really bother using this thing. Next up is a name I have not the slightest clue how to pronounce, and it is the Zillopotchli. I am pretty sure it is Zillopotchli. It is making me need to get a sip of water. 1 second. Okay. The Zillopotchli, or something like that. Whatever you say that, I have no clue. But it deals damage to an enemy. Has the same problem as Wolf Garrick. It deals damage to an enemy, boosted by purple gems, and if there is a storm, it deals double damage. So if the enemy dies, it also creates 12 skulls. So kind of like the Uminif, the Uminif. It's kind of like the Uminif, except way, way weaker. The biggest issue with this is it doesn't really synergize that well. It's kind of like Mother of Darkness, where maybe something will eventually be added that kind of makes it work, whereas Mother of Darkness was kind of bad before, but then something came in and just made her insane. And something might happen with this thing because, I don't know, just a weird mix because of all of its coloration and everything. It doesn't end up getting to utilize this as perfectly as it could potentially end up doing, especially with the fact that it ends up doing 12 random damage to an enemy when matching yellow gems, which, of course, combining that with that, like, you're not doing any yellow. But who knows? Maybe we'll get something and it'll just be the new Mother of Darkness at some point. Who knows? But as it currently stands, this thing is almost unusable with the kind of storms and the kind of synergies that exist within the game. And for that reason, it is just abysmal. There might come a time where it becomes S tier. Who knows? Mother of Darkness kind of showed that it can happen. So maybe it will, but as it stands, it would need something really specific, almost made specifically for this Mythic to work, to end up getting it going. And as it currently stands, that thing does not exist in the game, so we'll see in time. But as it stands, it is very useless. Anyways, next up, Mombasera. Mombasera, as far as Mombasera, it's basically a weaker version of Tina 9000 as well as Pan, as far as what it does. It splits its damage up a little bit more than Pan. It does 6 hits instead of 3. However, it does it basically even based on its magic with a very weird random number generator with it. Overall, it's just really bad. It's really luck-based. It's really random. It has no follow-up on it. It has no good traits. Basically, everything about it is abysmal. And yeah, I would not really bother with it. All it really needed was like, hey, create a bunch of green or something, given that you're going to be using it with green allies, and it would have been fine. Like, you give this thing like 10 green, give it like a Jasmine's Pride treatment, you'd kind of be okay. Or Jasmine's Chosen, whatever the thing was called. That was in B tier, but the Jasmine one, Jasmine Mythic. But if it had something like that, it could be okay, but it doesn't. And because it doesn't, it's just not good. It could add potential, but it kind of lost it all. And there's just so many better abilities out there that can end up doing it. Next up is Plague. Also, fun fact, the one I have the most copies of, I have 10 copies of Plague. I'm not sure how many people actually have 10 copies of a Mythic, but we're in the 10 club of people who have way too many of a single Mythic, which is kind of a bad thing, because obviously you do not want to get that unlucky. That would be horrifically bad if you're trying to find like the last 5 Mythics and you somehow have 10 of one. Luckily, we're not in that aspect, but that would hurt. But anyways, he's just bad. He does have Impervious going for him. He does have a little bit of stat reduction as well in there. Everything related to him, stat reduction. Oddly enough, an epic that you get for free from Merlantis is almost better than this thing, called Azura. It's a blue-purple, does a bunch of explosions. Uses the same color as him, too. Well, you know, uses green, too. He also ended up getting buffed recently, down to 20 mana cost. He was like 22 or 24 before. That was not enough to make him viable. Give him some board control, he could have, but he doesn't. So Azura is actually better. Azura has Dispel in it, too, and while it does do less stat reduction, it has extra turn potential and mana accumulation potential, so it theoretically, in effect, does more stat reduction than Plague does. So overall, just really, really bad. Maybe if they made it Poison, Disease, and Curse, we could be starting to get somewheres, because then we could start using it as an alternative for some other things, but even then, it probably wouldn't be enough. And just overall, it's seen better days and just is not viable these days. Speaking of that, a really weird one that is actually not viable is Nisha. So Nisha is chosen, I believe it is. Nisha. Nisha is not under ends. Where are you? What is the first part of your thing? Will of Nisha, aha. So Will of Nisha, the Nisha medal might be the strongest medal in the game, or one of the strongest. However, the Will of Nisha, the Mythic itself, is so ridiculously bad. I wish they would have made it like a Yagwe, where it converted like all yellow to purple or something like that, but they didn't. It steals magic from all enemies that it hits, and then deals damage to them. And, it deals damage to all enemies and steals some magic from them. But yeah, that's all it does. No board control, no follow-up, no nothing. Yagwe's better than this thing. This could have been the Mythic version of Yagwe, but they didn't do it that way, so it's kind of bad. And there's really no reason you need to touch it. Even if they lowered it to 20 mana cost, wouldn't be viable enough to use. All purple allies do gain 1 to all stats at the start of each turn, but that's not really going to be able to do much, even though purple is a pretty strong typing. This has some spell reduction, but its ability is just way too abysmal. And could have had a lot of potential, but it kind of got flopped. Anyways, next one, we got Gargantar. So as far as Gargantar is concerned, Gargantar is kind of like the joke Mythic that has kind of always been like the worst Mythic. However, there are a few that are technically worse than it, but it was kind of the first original worst Mythic. So in everyone's hearts, he is still the worst Mythic in the game, just because he was the original. But anyways, he deals damage to enemies and then is boosted by all allies and enemies killed. So theoretically, if you got something like 10 kills in a battle, he'd hit for like 200 or 150 plus whatever his base is. So in that regard, yeah, a lot of damage. But you know how hard it is to even get a single kill to end up getting that boost ratio? Like, he doesn't even start getting like half his damage up. Like, you would need 3 kills to get 45 additional damage. And at that point, you only have one less enemy to kill. So it's just really, really weird. Like, this used to be like a little bit more usable when like Dragon's Eye could count as a kill when the transform did, and then they patched that, which ended up nerfing him even more, which would just kind of put him even further into his grave, which he was already in forever. But oh no, it's just so bad. I'm not sure why they made it so bad. It's just bad in every way. You would never use it ever. Just don't use it. You would need to eventually get it though for Kingdom Upgrade, because the Shade of Zorn is even worse. But anyways, next up on our list is Fallen Valdis. So Fallen Valdis was kind of made to counter Divines back when Divines were at their peak, but it was so bad that it couldn't even counter Divines. So they had to nerf Divines because this troop wasn't good enough at countering Divines because it's so bad. It deals damage to an enemy or all enemies, and it explodes 3 Doom Skulls boosted by Divine enemies, which generally you're just barely even 3 Doom Skulls on a board at a given time. And even if you can get up to 7 by the whole team being Divine, that's not that helpful. It also silences all Divine enemies, but that's not too useful given how much cleanse and everything they have, so that doesn't really help. Especially your Voice of Orpheus, you just take a single yellow, boom, they already got their got it right back up. But yeah, and also gets a disease random enemy when matching purple gems, but compared to something like Truffle, why would you ever try using Fallen Valdis for it? Truffle does it 1,000 times better, since it can do it off an extra turn, and it's just a better troop in general, and even after the nerf, it still can loop infinitely, or pretty much infinitely, so yeah, Fallen Valdis is completely useless. And lastly, well, I guess there's technically 2 left, but this is technically the last one. Obviously, the treasure is just, you know, the treasure is just treasure, obviously it's the worst one. But Shade of Zorn, so the worst mythic in the game, kind of. They're all 4 of these are basically the worst. Almost all of them are, but particularly these last 4. But anyways, it deals damage to an enemy boosted by red allies and skulls. And then if the enemy dies, it summons 2 Fists of Zorns. Not only do these Fists of Zorns not come in with full mana, which even if they did, that wouldn't even be too much better, but it would be a little bit better at least. But it's just so little damage for how much mana cost it is. You do that for 24 mana cost. Even at 20 mana cost, it'd be pretty expensive. And he does have a really interesting final trait though. He gains 4 mana when he takes damage, so you could kind of just keep taking damage on him and deliberately do so with some abilities, and even get a poison on him. Or actually, no, you can't get a poison because I'm immune to poison. We can get a bleed on him and kind of do it that way. But in premise could potentially be okay, but overall just doesn't end up doing it. And Monk's kind of mana that it accumulates passively is kind of like an effect like that you can end up using that way. But Monk does it way, way, way better as far as gaining mana passively directly through something. And of course, you can end up doing it Mistralis as well. Just take a single extra turn, get enchant for everything, boom, you're good to go. But yeah, he's just really bad. His ability is so abysmal. Like, he has an ability to get more mana for an ability that's already useless, which is just really funny. And anyways, obviously Sacred Treasure is the absolute worst because it's Sacred Treasure. It's not actually a mythic. It theoretically counts as a mythic. It's literally under the mythic category. But you know, it's technically not a mythic, but I figured we include it. But anyways, guys, gosh, that took forever. But there we go. We have gone over every single mythic that is in Gems of War. Hopefully I did not forget one. Why do I feel like I might have? Hopefully we did not. But anyways, if we did, someone will mention in the comment section. But anyways, that is every single mythic up to the end of 2020. I hope you all have a wonderful new year and a wonderful 2021. If you still have any other questions, feel free to leave it in the comment section below. Anyways, guys, thank you for such a great year and for all the support. We're almost up to 5 years with the channel, and I greatly appreciate all the support up to this point and all the new support and all the new people we've been seeing. It's always very helpful. And of course, for any of you that don't know, we do stream every single night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time going over Gems of War. And we also throw in some other streams here and there going over other various stuff. But anyways, guys, thank you as always. Hope you all have a wonderful year, and I will catch you guys later. Goodbye, everyone. And thank you all so much for watching, and best of luck with your mythic hunts. Goodbye, everyone.